I'm Christine Roman.
And I'm Jonathan Graves. Welcome to Pediatric View Perspectives. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about what makes CVI unique. Christine, how would you define CVI and what makes it different from other kinds of conditions?
Well, I think I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about my experience as a teacher of the visually impaired, a young teacher of the visually impaired who was sent out to schools as an itinerant teacher to work with children primarily who had eye disorders. And I felt pretty skilled in that area. And then I encountered some children who were referred to me that certainly acted like they didn't see properly, or sometimes seemed like they didn't see at all. And yet when I looked in their records, I could find nothing in the eye reports that indicated that there was a problem with their eyes. Well, I came to make this my passion and learned very quickly that there are two essential forms of visual impairment. And, they're really centered on things that happen to the structure or function of your eye or the structure and function of the visual parts of your brain. And CVI is, of course, associated with the parts of your brain that regulate vision, because most vision actually happens not in the eye but in the brain. So I would define it by saying it is a brain-based form of visual impairment that is associated with a distinct set of behaviors that helps us recognize that this child is having a visual difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely. Those behaviors, I think, are really key. They're the key thing that distinguishes CVI from other conditions, and not only other vision conditions, but those behaviors help us really place CVI into a context for a child who may have other concerns and needs. And sometimes we find that there's a desire to kind of untangle what causes a child to what's driving them to make the choices they're making or have the preferences that they have. So let's talk a little bit about the outcomes that we expect for children with CVI. Is this something that improves on its own, or what? How do we frame those outcomes?
Right. So I think once we identify a child with CVI, that's a huge issue and very, very important step. I'm going to sort of take a side trip here and just mention that the diagnostic criteria really are three things, essentially. The child has an eye exam that doesn't explain the way they see, right? So we see how many children have you seen who, when somebody looks at them, they don't sort of see visual impairment, and then they say, but the eye doctor said their eyes were fine, right? So that's one. The second is that they have a history of a big neurologic condition that impacts, the structure or function of their brain. So there are many conditions that cause other things like cerebral palsy and seizures and so forth. But all of those underlying neurologic conditions actually are the second diagnostic criteria. And the third, as you mentioned, are those important characteristics. Once we can wrap our arms around that, identify the child, assess them properly, and put the right supports in place, we expect change. There's an expectation of improved functional vision, because CVI should not be considered a static condition. It is one that is changing relative to what we're experiencing every day, right? So what would happen, Jonathan, if a child who has CVI is not properly identified and is in a visually kind of hostile, difficult to understand environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know the answer to that from children who we see, who we meet later in their lives, and they haven't been identified appropriately when they were young, and they've carried this condition for a number of years. And I think what we often see is that those children will tend, because the visual information around them does not make sense to them and can't be prioritized internally, they choose to disregard it because it doesn't have the kind of meaning and saliency that it typically would have if they were processing it. So in the absence of that visual access, children will turn to other kinds of sensory input that does make sense to them. And that's often that they'll focus on what they hear, and they may focus more on what they're feeling, what their tactile sense is,
what they touch, right?
Yeah.
And so too, I think it may be also useful to think a little bit about one of the most difficult questions we're asked, which is, how does a person with CVI see the world? And they can see. They're not blind. These children are not blind. The information's coming into their eyes. But the difficulty comes in being able to interpret what they see, right? So the world to them might be perceived as a kind of just a meaningless collection of color and pattern, and so that's where an investigation of those characteristics, the 10 visual and behavioral characteristics, help us create a picture of whether that third criteria is there. Does the child show these characteristics? And we'll talk about those in upcoming sessions.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a good day.